What a great honor to be back here at the Conference on Indonesian Foreign Policy. I live in Perth, Western Australia, so that means that for us, this is our northern neighbor. The closest you can get is to Jakarta. And for me, this conference, primarily because of you, the audience, is one of the highlights of the year. We have been tasked with a very broad topic this year, reimagining the next world order, what's worth keeping, what should be changed, and why. In many respects, Pak Dino already answered this question. He gave a remarkable speech. Fortunately, we're able to kind of look at the things he mentioned in his speech, the overall theme of this conference, in this plenary panel to have a chance to do that. So what I'm going to do first and foremost is introduce and then welcome up onto the stage the speakers who will be part of this panel. And so as I introduce you in turn, I would ask you all to please come up to the stage. Then I'll sit down and then kick off quite quickly the panel discussion. Our first panelist needs no introduction here in Jakarta. It is Professor Dewi Fortuna Anwar, who is the co-founder of FCPI, research professor at the Research Center for Politics and the National Research and Innovation Academy. Ibu Dewi, thank you. The second panelist has already had his groundbreaking new book and his research referred to several times in the opening sessions. Professor Amitav Acharya, author of The Once and Future World Order, Distinguished Professor of International Relations at the School of International Service at American University. He literally wrote the book on the panel of our topic here today. Third, we'll be joined by Professor John Packer, Associate Professor of Law and inaugural Nuremberger Jessine Professor of International Conflict Resolution at the University of Ottawa. Then we'll be joined by Dr. Henry Huiyao Wang, who's the founder and the president of the Center for China and Globalization and a former counselor of the State Council of China. And last, but certainly not least, Bob Dean, the head of the security unit of the Clicquendale Institute of the Netherlands. Bob, please welcome. Please join me again in welcoming this magnificent panel of discussants. Now, just a quick reminder to our panelists. This audience isn't a normal foreign policy audience. One of the great things about this annual conference on Indonesian foreign policy is the opportunity for us to speak to the rising generations. And so as we talk about the topic that we've been given today, reimagining the next world order, I'm going to reemphasize something that we said earlier. It's not a new world order. We're not building something out of scratch. We're building on what has happened over a long period of time. And on top of that, we want to look forward with a little bit of vision, because this audience, except for a few old people in the front row, and I was on the front row just a minute ago, right, is going to be the generation that has to do the things that we're talking about. So I would urge our panelists to give remarks in that context of speaking to those people who are going to be doing the things we're talking about, who are actually going to be building that next order. We're going to go a little bit out of order, at least in the initial two speeches. Rather than starting with Ibu Dewi, we're going to start with Professor Amitav, because I mentioned at the very beginning, Amitav, that you literally have just written a book on this topic. I know you've given a lot of thinking it. So I'd like you to address the broader topic of the next world order, how it changes in light of your book, but also welcome you to react to Pak Dino's opening remarks and the theme overall. Amitav.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you very much. Great to be here again. I wish I could shout like Pak Dino, but everybody, very happy to see you. Let me make 3 points. First is, before we go to the next, let's reflect for a moment what is ending. Then we can say what is coming. So what is ending is what is known as the unipolar moment, dominated by the US, but also what is called the liberal international order. You have heard this term many times, the LIO, liberal international order, which was put in place after World War II by the United States and its Western allies although with a lot of participation from other global south countries too, but the credit goes mostly to the US and its Western allies. And that order, based on it had multilateral institutions, still has free trade, democracy, but most importantly, Western dominance. The Western countries dominated this. Now, that is ending. Now, I would like to make a distinction between order and power. I am not saying the United States is declining as a power. The jury is still out. In many ways, the United States is actually even stronger. In terms of technology, its share of the world's GDP is actually 27%, gone up by 2% in the last 5 years or so. So I am not making the claim that US is declining. Europe is declining overall, but the United States isn't. But the US-led world order is not only declining, but it's over. And make a distinction between power and order. Second, why is it declining? Not just because people usually blame the rising powers, the rise of China, the rise of India, the rise of BRICS. They are undermining the liberal order. I would submit that the bigger threat to the US-dominated order is from within. Populism, Trump is the consequence of the rising populism because a good number of American voters felt that they have been left behind by the American internationalism, the preoccupation of the American elite with international affairs and promoting international order on their own terms, while leaving the American public behind. And the resistance to the liberal order is actually substantially from within and not from China, not from India, not from others. And the third point I like to make is what is coming now. Park Dino talked about the next world order. Now, I would like to emphasize that I don't think it's multipolarity. A lot of people think the next world order is a multipolar world. Now, to me, multipolar is just about the distribution of power, military economic power. World order is a lot more than power or military economic power. World order is also about leadership, interaction capacity, ideas and norms. It's much broader. Multipolarity is a kind of 19th century, early 20th century term, and we kind of beholden to this old idea. So going back to what Park Dino said just earlier, he talked a lot about middle powers. Now, in a multipolar world, middle powers have very little role. A multipolar world is a great power club. These are the concert of Europe, for example. They carve out the world, create spheres of influence. The role of non-great powers, regional powers like Indonesia, middle powers, also Indonesia and Brazil or others, they don't really get much space, at least conceptual space. Non-state actors, corporations. So I think the world is much more complex. It's led by many more actors than just great powers. And that's one thing we should think about. I call it a multiplex world rather than a conventional multipolar world. And I'll be happy to elaborate on this later and also when we go to my book launch after this panel. Thank you, God.
Fantastic. And I think if you haven't already gotten it, you'll find that Amitabh's book has really been the subject of tremendous conversations globally in the last couple of months. Ibu Dewi, you have been working on these issues from an Indonesian perspective for decades now, but increasingly not just Indonesia, the region more broadly, and then internationally. So I wonder if you'd share your perspectives on our theme today, the next world order.
Yeah, thank you, Gordon. Dr. Dino has given, I think, a magnificent overview, a keynote speech that has already covered all the grounds about the situations of the world, about the ending of the primacy of the West, the end of US unipolarity, the decline of international law, the dysfunction of multilateralism, and so on and so forth. And I have to confess that I'm a big fan of Amitabh. In fact, I'm struggling trying to write a paper on trying to implement multiplexity in this part of the world. But I would like to say, for countries that are not major powers, for the middle powers, the smaller countries, the decline of international law, the weakening of multilateralism is very concerning. Because for all of us that do not have real power in terms of military capability or economic might, our survival depends on the protection of international law. Our voice can only be heard through multilateral forums because we cannot talk in big voice where only the major players play. So for us, this is answering what's to keep. It is very important that international law and multilateralism continued to be nurtured. And here, what is the next world? This is where I think, where I will agree, and Amitav, in fact, talks of this later in his book, but Dino talks about the importance of regional organizations. Regional organizations tend to be dismissed. Tend to be not to be too counted in power equation. They are taught in something completely different, more in the realm of constructivism, but not in the world of realists. Because they see, this is very wishy-washy, then especially regional organizations like ASEAN, it doesn't have real power, doesn't have supranationality, and so on. But I agree with Dino that within each regions, regional organizations can play and have played a very important role in contributing to a regional order, maintaining peace and stability, and promoting cooperation also between that particular region and the wider world. So connections between regional organizations, I'll see this as building blocks for a new form of champions for multilateralism. So when the big players are no longer seriously championing international law and multilateralism, when they are into me first policy, then not just middle powers, but middle powers within their own particular regions, because middle powers also tend to lead the regional organizations in their respective regions, can play a very, very important role in developing these building blocks of multilateralism. And I think that is one aspect. But agency comes with a responsibility. So this is the end of a free ride. And I think that we have to ponder as middle powers and regional organizations want to play a greater role and to have a greater voice in shaping our next world. It also means that we need to be able to pay for it as well. So that means that, no more free riding. So greater agency, but also greater responsibility. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. John, we're going to turn to you next. Coming from Canada, obviously you're familiar with much of the discussion we're having right now. Canada has been particularly singled out in a way that's not normal in recent months. But you've given a lot of thought, given your academic and professional background, to the laws that underpin this question. So I wonder if you might address the broad question of the next world order.
Thank you for the question. First of all, I agree with the last speaker very much, these fundamental questions of international law. But I want to be a bit more optimistic for those who observe what's not working. I think it's quite clear there are things that are not working, like the Security Council or the World Trade Organization. But there's an awful lot that is working. I'm here right now, some of us are sitting here, because the international law, which governs air transportation, which governs diplomacy, the movement of persons. For example, I'm here because I have a passport. I got a visa on entry. All sorts of things. If I look at the clothes I'm wearing, made in different countries. I mean, this reminds me of, if we go back to Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, and he recounted 400 years ago what it took for an English gentleman to have breakfast. An awful lot of cooperation, and that was governed by trade arrangements, security arrangements, and so forth. So if I just mention a few things that affect people, intellectual property, telecommunications, all sorts of trade arrangements are actually working. And that's a good thing. Now, why are they working? They're working because there is compelling interest. They are supported fundamentally by needs of states, communities, people across frontiers. And we are facing more and more of this character of challenges which are transnational, global, climate change, pandemics, and many other things, which simply demand some kind of regulation on a global level that gives some degree of predictability that we can rely upon. It also raises questions about wrongdoers, those who are breaching the standard, putting in jeopardy others, and therefore I'm convinced that international law has not lost the day. It will remain. It's actually going to get thicker. And here again, I want to go back to our last speaker's references to regional relations. Probably the most successful counter to conflict and conflict prevention enterprise in the world is the European Union. And you may not have ever been to Europe, but in basically 2 or 3 generations, Europe has just amazingly developed and overcome all sorts of differences through a very thick legal order of many institutions that allow for free movement, free business, all sorts of things. So I just want to say that we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater and say things aren't working, international law should not be respected. I'd like to make the other argument that some things are working, but we do need to fix those things at a macro level which are not working.
Fantastic. My guess is even if there's law students in the audience, you might not have thought about thin law and thick law. So we're going to come back to that, I'm sure, very much. Henry, if I can go to you. You've had tremendous personal international experience in Canada, in the US, around the globe. But in your current role in China, leading one of the leading things there that look not just at China, but globalization, you've clearly given some thought to the next world order. Would you share your views, please?
Thank you. Thank you, Gordon. Yeah, excellent question. And I was quite impressed with what Pardino was presented this morning. What's the next global order? Which is exactly, we're at a crossroad, 80 years after UN and after Second World War. I think we are actually have a big paradigm shift that Amitav mentioned the multipolar world and also multilateralism. We need to innovate and need to renovate. And so what I think basically what's going to lead the next global order is this economic globalization and economic development and economic prosperity. That is what is needed for the next phase of the globalization and also global south. Majority of global south countries need that. So in that actual movement, the new movement of the global development and global sustainable development, I think China can play a very active role. First, I think the BRICS countries are really getting very active now. And also we see China launch the AIB, Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. And India is the largest recipient for these AIB loans. And of course, we had a BRICS, a new development bank, and SCO going to have another new development bank as well. So you see, those new institutions is going to really more and more come into play for the next phase of global economic order. Second, I think that I totally agree, this regionalism. While the total UN system under a lot of stress, but then we have a new regionalism thriving. For example, ASEAN, which is a miracle that is happening. We have the European Union, but we have ASEAN. And now we have this RCEP, the largest free trade agreement in the world, which is ASEAN, like countries, is China's largest trading partner for the last few years since RCEP. And also, furthermore, I think China has launched this Belt and Road Initiative, which is, for over $1 trillion has been invested, and 3,000 projects around the world, developing countries. For example, we have this beautiful speed railway from Jakarta to Bandung, cutting the 4 hours distance to 40 minutes. And then China is helping super connect ASEAN. You have China, Laos Railway, China Thai, China Malaysia, and of course China Indonesia. And then you can see this ASEAN going to be super connected in the economic transformation in the next decade. So I think this kind of economic globalization will probably have more important role to build prosperity rather than we build up the military budget, we overemphasize security, we really, living in a wrong direction. I think we need to come back for the next economic order, next global order, to go back to the basics. Let's build our prosperity, let's build our development, and let's build a better life. So that is already happening, and I think that ASEAN is a good example, and of course, China, and not only with ASEAN, but China, Africa, China, Latin America, China, Central Asia, Arab, many more, China, Europe. So I would agree that we have a tremendous change. We're at a crossroads, but we have to safeguard all the multilateral system. But at the same time, we could expand economic globalization, that global South, BRICS countries are become a strong driver, mid powers are stronger drivers in this big movement. Hopefully this movement will really come into more play and really coming down those military, security, arms race, that we don't need that. We need really economic race, Olympic style competition, and get rid of the rivalry that plague and really poisoning our global environment. And we need to fight climate change, pandemic and global debt. And so in that sense, next global order is really hopeful with the new forces coming from this multipolar world. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Bob, if we can go to you next. Already in the other panelists, there have been several references to the European Union. So Europe is one of those regional orders that is interacting increasingly with this regional order as well. Would you, from a European perspective, kind of address the broad question of the next global order?
Well, that's a wonderful question, Gordon, and a heavy responsibility. So first of all, nice to see all of you. Thank you for the energy in this room. I think for the Klingendahl Institute, this is something to aspire to organize conferences like this. Yes, to come to Europe, I saw in Park Dino's speech, there was a quote from Singapore, the old world is, or the old order is dying. I think this actually comes from the 1930s Europe, from an Italian Marxist who was in jail called Gramsci, who said that the old world is dying, but the new one is struggling to be born. And in the interregnum, as he calls it, all kinds of morbid symptoms appear. And this quote says a lot to me, because I think this is where we are right now. We see a lot of morbid symptoms, because the transition from the current to the next world order hasn't fully been completed. And these morbid symptoms are some of the things that Henry referred to: confrontation, arms race. We see within Europe right now, Gordon, an incredibly strong polarization within societies. The European Union is really not that popular. There are parties coming to power who want to leave it. The United Kingdom already did. So polarization is definitely there, confrontation. And I think I was most struck by Park Dino's speech that he hasn't seen it this bad as he has in the last 2 years. And of course, correctly, he named Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and Gaza. I mean, these are incredibly morbid symptoms of a system that cannot prevent atrocities and wars anymore. But if I come from Europe, I have to admit also our continent has an incredibly dark history. My own country, Netherlands, has a dark history in your country, Indonesia. But we learned some of these lessons the hard way. We fought destructive world wars with each other. We had horrible genocides. And we established some rules to stop this from happening again. And I think here I agree with Henry. Let's go back to the basics. Who here in this audience would want to go back to a world where the great powers can decide for the smaller countries and just impose their will? Who wants to go back to a world where borders can be changed by force and an aggressor can just take a piece of land from another country, as Russia thinks it can do to Ukraine, and claim to keep it? A topic that is literally on the agenda right now. Who believes that fighting a military war, using military means to resolve political differences, is a good idea? I don't think many of you in this room do, and afterwards, if you do, please come and see me, because I'd love to have a chat with you about it. And I think that is the foundation that we can build the next world order on. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are certain things that we all still agree on, or at least should agree on. The struggle that we have is how to uphold these norms. And I think this is why the criticism of hypocrisy and double standards is so warranted. The great powers cannot only use international law whenever it suits them and only impose it on others. They should actually be constrained by it themselves. And the Netherlands, my country, has always been at the forefront of trying to develop international law exactly to constrain the behavior of the larger states. And I think this is where we need to go back to. This is why the middle powers are so key or pivotal. They are pivot states. And why I want to also conclude with advising this role of regional organizations, because they can set norms also regionally. Now, John, you're more positive about the European Union than I am, but it is indeed a project of peace that managed to prevent countries like Germany and France of going to war with each other once again. There are other regional organizations in Europe. We developed a whole patchwork of them that guard certain legal norms, like the Council of Europe. And there's one that should guard security and cooperation. It's called the OSCE. I used to work with it. But they really struggle to maintain these norms right now. And I think we would be well advised to all go back to basics and remember that a new world war is the very last thing that we need. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Magnificent opening remarks. In the last month, in the month of November, I've been in 9 different countries, from India to Romania. And during the course of those travels, I can tell you that these themes that we're talking about today, the central theme of this conference today is on everyone's minds. They're concerned about the global order. They're concerned about the roles of like-minded partners, how we might work together. But for a second round of questions, I might take as an example kind of the last comment that Bob made and one of the very first comments that Ibu Dewi made, and that is new world orders or the next world orders are not born, they're built. And Ibu Dewi talked about building blocks for a new world order. And she referenced in particular middle powers, she referenced regional organizations, and every one of our panelists in some way or the other have talked about the building blocks for a next world order. So I want to go in reverse order. I want to start with you, Bob. You expressed a little bit of skepticism about the EU, but you also talked about what we don't want. We don't want to go back to a world where might makes right. We don't want to go back to a world where, to quote Thucydides, the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must, where you can change borders by force. We don't want that, right? But what is it that we do want? What are the building blocks in your mind that are most important to building the next world order?
Now, thanks so much, and I think that's the key question. I also heard from Dino, there's no point in just complaining about things. You need to be forward-looking. So a couple of the building blocks are there. First one is that countries such as Indonesia, the middle powers, the pivot states, are no longer passive bystanders. They are no longer only complaining and criticizing. They are taking ownership. And this allows for new alliances and partnerships to be built. And some of the very amazing partnerships are popping up. If we see certain behavior by certain great powers, like the United States or like the Russian Federation doing things, you see new coalitions being built of countries that say, that's not the way we would like to do things. And they actually create with each other a global push to either preserve things that are important to them, like multilateral institutions, or to advance things that are important to them that hasn't worked very well, like preventing global warming and climate change. I mean, my country is also 2 meters below sea level. Jakarta is also not very fond of rising sea levels. So it's something that unites us and that we can work on together. So here I believe there is definitely a building block. And the second thing that gives me confidence is that great power politics is no longer something that is only done by a handful of men in very fancy meeting rooms. But there's something like a global citizenry developing, that due to new technologies it's much easier for them to stay in touch. And they exercise pressure as well. They have agency. They actually hold their leaders to account, much more than in the past. And they can actually push for things like arms control or cooperation on climate change, things that really matter to citizens. And I think if we combine these two things, so the rising role of the middle powers and the push from below, from united citizenries that actually cooperate across borders, that gives me some confidence.
Thank you. Henry, leading a center that's focused on globalization. Globalization isn't a whole, it's built up from a lot of other things. From your perspective, what are the key building blocks for the next world order?
Well, I think that we have to strengthen the global system, particularly the UN, that has been there for 80 years. So coupled with the regionalism, but I think the centralism of the United Nations should be strengthened as well, particularly the UN Security Council. But in the past, 80 years, we've seen a number of abuse of the veto power at the UN Security Council. For example, we have seen the Russian has vetoed over 100 sometimes, US about 100 times, UK about 30 times, China probably 20 times, and France 18 times. So you see there's a superpower that really being over veto a lot of us, paralyze the UN. For example, issue of Gaza, issue of Ukraine, and many regional war. So I think we probably need to bring this new dynamic into the UN like a G20, right? I mean, it's the 85% of the global GDP, and we can probably have the G20 play more active role into the UN system. And the second, I think that we need to strengthen the existing global system, like WTO, which has been, for the last number of years, GDP has gone up hundreds of times thanks to the global trade, thanks to the globalization that lifted the billions of people out of poverty. And we need to strengthen that. We should not marginalize WTO. I think I'm glad to see, even though with some country attacking WTO or minimize WTO still practiced by over 160 some countries, and 85% of global trade still conducted according to WTO rules. And thirdly, like a WHO, we know certain countries is not happy, and then they're pulling out of the WHO. And China at this time actually stand up. China just announced they're going to donate $500 million to WHO, so that we do not want to see the pandemic coming back again for the developing world, and also the whole world. And also, so furthermore, I think also we have UNESCO, culture, civilization, are so important. We need to really have more UN heritage sites and maintain and reserve all those culture heritage we have for the humankind. And that should be supported as well. And of course, at the same time, we see new organization coming up, as I mentioned, AIB and also RCEP and all those liberalization schemes. So the next global order is that we need to maintain the existing order and enhance, enlarge, and improve, but at the same time creating some new organizations to safeguard that. For example, like AI. We are in a danger of AI now, and also climate change. We are as our friend just mentioned, we have AI threatening our existence. So those things that we should have to work together and make good use of that. My center, we launched a alliance of a global talent organization. We have a capital flow, goods flow, and now we need a people talent flow. So I think talent, we need a global promoting the free flow of a talent to benefit the world. So many things can be done that we have to really work hard to sustain the future of the globalization.
Thank you, John. You spent a lot of time talking about law, which in many respects is a foundational element, but it's also, maybe if it's thicker, a building block. Would you address the question of what you think the building blocks are for the next world order?
Well, first of all, I want to say I agree, especially with the last remarks of Henry. Globalization is not going away. It's actually probably going to mount. And if we look at some of the contemporary challenges, for example, artificial intelligence, I think we have to think really in new paradigms. I'm thinking myself of a meeting I had this morning on this little device, which did not exist 30 years ago. But I spoke with people in 5 different countries about an issue in a 6th country. And my question is, where was the meeting? Was it on the machine? Was it in the 5 countries? No, it's in this cyberspace. But we don't really regulate these things. We don't regulate the social media. We don't have a convention on artificial intelligence. We don't have all sorts of ways that allow for predictability, which address those who are going to be abusive. So I don't know do I have reliability in my communications with those 5 people in 5 different countries? Who's listening in? How is that controlled? So I think that we really need to think about this in terms of a changed world. And in that changed world, we also need to know that there are many things for which no state acting alone can actually control the matter. Climate change is such an example. We may talk about superpowers, but no single state in the world is such a power that they can simply control, for example, the ozone layer. That required a treaty, and it was addressed. So I think we need to change our basic perception of the world in which we're actually living in. It is one of increasing globalization, actually, but it's also with many non-state actors, social communities, and some of them are, of course, abusive, and we need reliability. The last thing I want to say about this is we cannot afford exceptionalism. The idea that there are those who will arrogate to themselves some other authority and simply say we exempt ourselves from these rules, the ozone layer would not be addressed if major powers simply said we forget about it. Similarly, climate change will not be addressed if some countries simply say we're not following. In terms of structure, there is a hierarchy. There are fundamental questions, such as the use of force. If we do not rely upon the prohibition of the use of force for unilateral use of force for settlement of disputes or changing frontiers, all the rest unravels. So there is a kind of hierarchy. But I believe, I'm confident in this generation. I have watched my own children playing online games with people in multiple countries, simultaneously exchanging. That social dynamic is real, and it needs to have an expression that is foreseeable, reliable, and in common interest, and that will come through cooperation.
Amitav, you've done a great job of describing what is changing, and you also made it very clear the difference between order and power. The old order, however, was built on a foundation of American power, right? And that's changing. And so in an environment where that foundational power is fading, as you described so well, what are the building blocks for the next order?
Thank you. Let me start with a very broad comment. And I've just done this book that looks at 5,000 years of world order building. And I have a few insights. One of the insights is that most changes in order are evolutionary, not revolutionary. Now, if you look at the last 300 years, the big changes in order building has come from, say, the defeat of Napoleon in 1814 led to the conquest of Europe, change of order. But that required a major war. World War I, League of Nations, didn't work, but a major war. Then the post-war liberal order, World War II. So major changes in world order happens after major wars. But that does not mean that's the pattern in history. Most of the changes in order are evolutionary rather than revolutionary. So I've just written and published an article in World Today and Chatham House, which basically argues that the next world order will be actually, in many ways, very similar to what we have. Not all the institutions will go away, but there will be new elements. Unless there is a major war, okay? And one of these institutions will be multilateralism. I do agree that the UN is a big family of institutions, and some are more efficient than others. So maybe the Security Council is less effective, but the World Bank or IMF is not, and UNDP. And I think UNESCO does a great job of preserving heritage. I am a UNESCO chair. But more than that, also global governance and multilateralism is no longer state-centric. It involves non-state actors, corporations and foundations. The Gates Foundation pays a lot of money for health governance. And also, when it comes to actors in global order, people are increasingly important. We talked about social media. In fact, social media and people like yourself, you are actually builders of global order. I know this because you are empowered by social media. Just imagine that somebody with a following of 200 followers in, say, the X, sometimes has a tweet that goes viral, and that has a huge global impact. And it would not be possible. And remember, just think of TikTok. TikTok basically defeated the United States because Trump accepted it, because young people love it. So young generation, social media makes a huge difference, and that becomes a building block of the next global order. And one other thing I would like to conclude with, that any ideas or building blocks of global order will not come from one place. It'll come from multiple places. And again, that's another lesson of my book. Almost all major institutions of world order, whether it's the sovereignty or independence of states, the first diplomacy and peace treaty was in 1259 in the ancient Near East. The first boundary marker was in 2500 BC in the ancient Sumer. The freedom of the seas as a doctrine was developed right around Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, well before Hugo Grotius kind of made it more famous. And also the idea of peaceful coexistence that China and India have talked about. Actually, we had many examples of peaceful coexistence. The Iroquois Confederacy in North America had 500 years of peaceful coexistence. So whatever you think of a building block is not going to come from one country. No one has a monopoly on building world order. World order is a shared creation. It's not a monopoly. And which is why I'm also optimistic that the end of the American-led world order after World War II doesn't mean collapse or chaos. It will actually lead to something more pluralistic, more possibly more inclusive, if not possibly more peaceful, although it could be. But let's have some optimism for the younger generation here that you can all make a difference.
Ibu Dewi, this round of questions was based on in your observation. From an Indonesian perspective, we've already seen that very impressive calendar from your president in the first year, and we also had Dino's speech. What did they miss in terms of building blocks, or what did they say that you think deserves to be focused on from an Indonesian perspective? What are the building blocks of the next world order that this audience should pay attention to?
Well, I think, I agree with everything that has been said here. And Amitav has mentioned about, the importance of a more multiplicity of actors. But we also have reality check. When it comes to solving Gaza, there's only one gentleman who can force the other gentleman. One gentleman in Washington who can force another gentleman in Tel Aviv to do anything. No matters how united we are. And in fact, the world was united. Of the 5 permanent P5 in the Security Council, 4 voted for the Palestinian independence. 1 vetoed it. And, all the traditional allies of Israel, except the US, have condemned what has happened in Gaza. But reality here, the reality check, power does matter. So in this sense, when we are talking about building the next world order, we have to be much more aware of that, on the one hand, values and norms are extremely important. Rules are very important. But at the same time, power is also there. And there's always this tension. Yeah? And sometimes, in order to enforce the rules, we need the power. So to enforce the UN Security Council resolutions, we need real power. China is a very big power. It cannot do it. Yeah, why not? Russia is making trouble somewhere else. It doesn't do anything about what's happening in Gaza. The UK are still, Dino has demoted them to become middle powers, but they're still big powers. They're nuclear powers. They're P5, but they're not able to do it. Why can't the 4 P5s, out of the 4 permanent secretaries. Do something about it. And this is a reality check that the power still matters. But on the other hand, when it comes to making norms, John mentioned about no country should be exceptional. The US boycotted the COP30. Agreement still came about. The people who attended still managed to make an agreement. The US boycotted the G20 in South Africa. In fact, it's probably easier to come to a consensus because of that, because climate change is an issue. So when it comes to building norms, rules, and regulations, having the willingness to cooperate and having the ability, to transcend differences is very important. But when it comes to doing something that needs muscles to force compliance, I don't think just calling people to behave. We have found this in ASEAN. ASEAN is very successful. Now Amita has written a number of articles on this. As a norm entrepreneur, it's creator for institutions, creator of platforms and multiple actors engaging with outsides. Can ASEAN do anything about Myanmar? Can ASEAN speed up the COC in the South China Sea? And so on and so forth. So here, I think, this is an exercise for IR specialists, how do we calibrate the dynamics between norms and naked power? Okay. And probably Amita will answer that in the next book too.
Well, thank you. Those were amazing answers. I think one could probably agree that historically, so much of what we would call globalization or a global order has had as one of its primary drivers economic integration, markets, the desire of people to kind of interact. And whether it's the example of cell phones or Henry's comments about the importance of economic globalization and his reference to the regional cooperative economic partnership, I would say I was encouraged recently by Indonesia's decision to accede to the OECD. All those things going on. That's quite a remarkable development. Another thing I would point to as an example of a building block that is not one that involves one of the great powers would be the CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. In January of 2017, when the US pulled out of that, most people, myself included, thought that the TPP was dead without a major power underneath it. But since then, you've seen Japan and Australia work together to resurrect it. The original TPP became the Cooperative and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. And as it has grown now with the UK joining it, and eventually, hopefully, Indonesia expressing some interest, Thailand expressing some interest, South Korea expressing some interest, China expressing interest, there's a chance that those building blocks of the economic integration that we talked about that drive so much aren't gone. So I do appreciate the fundamental optimism of everybody here. These desires on the part of individuals, especially the rising generation here, haven't gone away. I have a lot of other questions. I'm going to ask all of our panelists to keep in your mind one question, because I'm going to come back to it at the end of the question from the series is, if you can speak specifically to the generation here that is going to be in a senior role 20 years from now, what would your advice to them be? What advice would you give to the rising generation about the next world order? Because they're going to be looking back on these comments 20 years from now. Now, we're right at the end of our moderated conversation. We have a microphone here in the middle. I think there's another one elsewhere. We're going to open this up to question and answers from the audience. We've only got about 20 minutes, and so I'm going to ask for quick, punchy questions. Feel free to address them to an individual panelist, or feel free to open it up for the panel as a whole. I would ask that you quickly identify yourselves. Tell us where you're coming from before you ask your question. And the warning is, if you're not already tired of my voice, if you don't have questions, I have questions. And so please, I'll open up to the audience for questions. Anybody who's got a question? Here in the back, go ahead and come up to the microphone here, if you would. We got a microphone right here in the middle, if that's okay. Please. Terima kasih. And briefly introduce yourself and ask your question.
Okay, Thank you for the opportunity for the speaker. My name is Prita Arianti. I'm chemistry teacher, and then I want to ask him how to solve the problem for the world, similar like the war in the Gaza and Israel, and could you give it the simple step to solve that problem? Example for the Union Europe, how to solve it, and the contribution to that problem, because it's very long to solve it, and how to the America and Australia and another country in the world to solve that problem for the child and the human, and the solve of that is the solve for the Hamas, but that is that area or the regional, but there are some people want to make a problem to and want to to steal the region of the Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is a really good question. How do you solve the problem of war? Right? Because there are bad actors. As she indicated, there are people that want to steal, people who don't want to do that. So maybe we might start with you, Ibude, because she asked for a simple answer, and we know there is no simple answer. But how do you solve the problem of war, when there requires power to solve war? Right?
That is very tough, and I think that this is engaging us in Indonesia, because as you know, Pak Prabowo has weighed in, made a commitment at the UN to send 20,000 Indonesian peacekeepers to Gaza to keep a peace when, there is no peace yet. And at the moment, Israel has definitely rejected any mention or any commitment to a two-state solution. And Hamas and a number of other groups have rejected the UN-supported International Stabilization Force. So this is going to be very, very difficult. Now, I don't have a simple question, but Indonesia has a leverage. Indonesia, for a long time, has been a steadfast friend of the Palestinians, of all sides. The Palestinian Authority, as well as with Hamas. Indonesia has hosted meetings between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority here in Jakarta. And I remember Pak Yusuf Kala, as vice president, hosted it. And they say, you solve your problems first before you can, solve the problems with the outside, until and unless the intra-Palestinian fragmentations are also resolved between the Palestinians, then it will be very difficult for others really to weigh in. Now here, I think the Indonesia can play an honest broker. We don't have a fish to fry there, unlike the immediate neighboring countries who have histories and who may be regarded as having their own vested interests. So how do we solve it? I think the most important thing is how to build trust first. What is our position? I don't think we regard the UN, the Trump-sponsored peace in Board of Peace, whatever, that's Russia and China abstained, but they didn't veto. But without this, there's no way forward either. And I think that instead of simply criticizing that this is not perfect, we can say that the enemy of progress is perfection. If we want anything, we want to avoid having to demand perfect answers. And here, the trusted friends of Palestinians of all sides need to be able to talk to them, and while the trusted friends of Israel need also to talk to Israel and bring, the Hamas and the Israelis to accept the less than perfect way forward.
Thank you. A great lesson in life that the enemy of progress is perfection in regards. Bob, I want to turn to you on this too, then I'll come back to you, Henry. That this is no longer academic for Europeans. We can no longer talk about post-war Europe. There's a war raging in the middle of Europe. And so I wonder if you might take that question to heart, from your perspective? What do we need to do? We thought we'd kind of done it, right? What do we need to do to solve war?
And thanks for that question. And I mean, you are a chemistry teacher, I understand, and I wish I had a simple formula. Put these things together and you will never have war again. If we were able to do that, we should have done it a long time ago. I would argue centuries ago. Now, what we learn from what is happening in Gaza, and let me be honest to you here, I'm from the Netherlands. This issue is tearing my country up from the inside. There are diplomats protesting in front of their foreign ministry about it in the Netherlands. There are large-scale protests, the largest since the end of the Cold War, in the Netherlands about this conflict. This is really dividing our country, and it's a very emotional issue. And what we learn from this one is, first of all, impunity breeds more war later down the line. Because there have been different agreements on Gaza before. They were all broken. More atrocities happened, more impunity. The second thing we know is that an unfair agreement will not hold, because it will be resisted by the people affected by it. So just imposing a settlement that is not accepted as legitimate will not hold. And the third thing that I think we learned is there is no way you can solve something like this militarily. Not only shouldn't you do it, because it leads to atrocities and worse, but also it will not work in the longer run. And I think we can take all of those lessons and apply them directly to that major war, Gordon, that you mentioned, that is raging in the heart of Europe, that is really affecting us, and that's Russia's war against Ukraine, where we have the fear in Europe that the same things may happen. An unfair agreement imposed on a country, a military solution, basically a country like Russia being rewarded for military aggression, and an agreement that then will not hold. And these are lessons that we should have learned, because actually if you look at preventing war, the way you end a war really influences the chances of it starting up again. So if you want to end the cycle of violence, if you want to do conflict prevention, something that John and I both worked on quite passionately for large parts of our career, you have to make sure that agreements reached are just and fair. Thank you.
Henry, you wanted to add on to this?
Yeah, I think this is actually, we should really come back to the UN, to strengthen the UN role on that. I'm very glad to hear President of Indonesia mention that they have 20,000 peacekeeping forces ready, available to deploy. And actually China is the second largest peacekeeping budget contributor in the United Nations, and the largest peacekeeping sending country at the UN. So I think China, I do see the BRICS countries have more roles to play now with this multipolar world, and to maintain the peace should play more important role. For example, China broke the peace deal for Saudis and Iranians. China gathered 14 Palestinian factions in Beijing to publish the Palestinian Declaration in Beijing. But also, for Mr. Wang Yi said, BRICS countries are one of the best mediators and peacekeepers. So I think if that is necessary, the BRICS countries, India, China, Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, can send in the peacekeeping force for Ukraine or Gaza. I wrote an op-ed at Foreign Policy before Alaska Summit. I said BRICS countries probably can play more important role in keeping the peace. So in that sense, I think we have to come back to the roots of the UN Security Council, where I think one country should not unilaterally veto those peacekeeping plans. So if we can solve that in the future, then we can always send peacekeeping forces of all those countries made of Europe, BRICS, even US, and then let's maintain the peace. So that probably is the direction to go for the future of the peacekeeping of the world.
Very good. John?
Yeah, if I can just add to this. What we have done in the last 100 years is progress significantly in terms of what we believe should be the case. So already about 100 years ago, the Kellogg-Briand Pact outlawed war as an instrument of foreign policy, in fact. The UN Charter confirmed that 80 years ago, making the use of force to settle disputes unlawful. And I could add many more norms and standards. So we know what should be. I can even say that we know how many of the causes of these conflicts can be resolved through accumulated knowledge of dispute management, conflict resolution, different processes and so forth. Where we're failing is the effective implementation of these. It's not that we don't know what should be done, we're just not doing it. We talk about the failure of the Security Council and so forth. In this regard, I think there is an increasing role, not just for the BRICS, I would say for the world at large. The powers that are exempting themselves, they are significant, I agree with you, but they're not so dominant that they used to be. And I think this needs to be taken into account, and the rest of the world needs to step up. BRICS, Indonesia, it's very good to see. If we talk about peacekeeping, the old system has been overtaken by the new system, and many other actors are now engaged. So my message would be, it's not that we don't know what should be, we actually have the norms, we need to make them effective.
Amitav, in your last comments, you kind of hedged it a little bit. You said the long-term decline of a unipolar moment and of the West, would lead to a more pluralistic order. And you said, which hopefully will be peaceful. But I'm kind of curious, is absent power, right? Absent power to kind of solve these things, how do you avoid war?
Okay. So again, drawing on history, I don't find a lot of evidence that you need a hegemon to prevent war. In fact, evidence has been contrary. If you have a very big power, like a Roman Empire was a very brutal empire. The Greek city-states, on the other hand, they actually were relatively peaceful. So my first lesson that I learned from my research and writing is that you don't need a hegemon to prevent war. Hegemons actually create wars. There is no such thing as a hegemonic stability. It's hegemonic instability. So this is why I said, just because the US is declining doesn't mean there'll be more war. There could be actually less war. You know how many wars the United States has started in the 21st century as a hegemon, since it became really the global superpower, even Britain for that matter. But I would approach this question in a different way. I don't think you can prevent war, okay? There is, throughout the, a known history of 5,000 years of world order, war is kind of always there. But what you can do is to limit the consequences of war. Limit the damage of war. And that's where humanitarian norms of warfare are very important. I'll give you the example of ancient India. It's not a peaceful place. It was a very violent place. But the lawgivers of ancient India, including a guy called Manu, devised a number of rules that almost word by word mirror anticipated the Geneva Conventions. So do not strike, do not attack civilians. Do not use poisonous weapons, or you can call chemical weapons, but do not use poison in fighting. Do not attack someone who has surrendered, a soldier that has surrendered. Do not kill somebody who is fleeing. All these rules are laid out, called Code of Manu. Translations are available, and I quote in my book, and the Geneva Conventions reproduce them. I don't think they acknowledge it, but the thing is, these rules can come from multiple places, and certainly from the Christian tradition of just war, but Indian tradition of what they call Code of Manu, humanitarian warfare, is possible. Because the Indian lawgivers realize they can't stop warfare, but they can limit the damage, otherwise far more people will die. So just imagine this Israel-Palestinian, Israel-Gaza, the big issue here, the tensions and conflicts were there, but so many rules are broken. Attacking, killing civilians, and making no distinction between civilians and so-called terrorists. So I think there's a complete breakdown of these humanitarian principles of war. And we must, and also the international criminal justice system has to be strengthened. So people like Netanyahu should be treated as war criminals. As some European countries like Slovenia has forbidden him from coming there. He will not be probably arrested. He goes to Europe. I think we should, until now, the International Criminal Code, which the United States has not signed or ratified, they basically apply it to African countries. Now it's time to apply it to everybody, or at least have a movement calling for that. So that will have some deterrent effect, even if you cannot abolish the principle, abolish warfare completely. You can limit the damage.
Thank you, very clear. We've got time, only 5 minutes left, so one quick question. Any quick question? This gentleman right there in the white jacket. And again, please introduce yourself.
Well, thank you. My name is Andrei. I'm from Satyawacana Christian University from Salatiga. And actually, I have a lot of questions for our distinguished guest today. But Mr. Moderator, can I ask more like 3 questions here for now? Is that possible?
We've only got 5 minutes left and
Only
5
5
panelists,
okay.
so pick your favorite question.
Then okay, let's put it this way. We don't know when it will happen, but one thing that's clear right now is, let's say after 10 or maybe 20 or maybe 50 years, there will be, let's say, like one great power in this world. And now we can see that the leading country is China. Maybe I think you agree also with me in this case. So my question to Mr. Henry also, is that like I'm sorry, like R.G. Collingwood was said. This I want to quote something that the only clue to what man can do is what man has done. So now we see what America do, what USA doing right now, and what USA did right now before. So the question is, if the possibility that China will be the leading country in the world after 50 years or maybe more or maybe less, how can you prevent this to prevent this thing to repeat what that USA did and doing right now? And that is my question.
Thank you. That's a really good question. So Amit has done a great job of looking at the history. How do we avoid repeating history if China can only do the things that have been done in the past? So I'm gonna ask you to answer that question, Henry, and then I'm gonna very quickly go to each panelist and ask you in turn just to give a little bit of advice to the future generation here. So Henry, your answer and then your advice to the future generation.
Yeah, thank you, Gordon. Thank you for the question. I think that the China's rise and peaceful rise is really a good contribution to the world, because, but we can be sure of that China would not follow the past, powers, which they rise on the colonial, on the war basically. But China, thrives on the internal development. And then you look at the DNA, 5,000 years of history of China. China is largely a middle kingdom. And then even in the Ming Dynasty, we had the Marshal Zheng He, expedition 7 times out of China. They haven't really conquered or occupied any places. So in the DNA, they don't have the expansionist mode there. And also, Confucius said, if your parents are alive, don't travel far away. So the agriculture of cultivating the land along the Yangtze River and the Yellow River have kept the Chinese people in its own land. And then they never really invaded any other countries, not hordes on the nation or Norman and like Mongolians. So you can be assured of the culture of China is a peaceful culture, and that is really get along. And Confucius said, peace is the most important thing. And so I think, if that happens, that would be fine. For example, China now is leading the green globalization now. I mean, UK lead the industrial revolution, and US lead the digital internet revolution. China is now leading the green revolution. So that is really going to be the contributing to the world. So I think that you can be assured of that China will be really a peacemaker. You should not worry about.
Okay, your advice for the future generations. Real quickly, if you have just a short sentence. You, Henry, we'll start with you, Henry. If you're looking at this young group here, what do you think they should be focusing on 10, 20
My advice for these great young people is that you should have a global vision and a local action. So basically, go localization. global vision and local action. So have a global vision of the world. We are getting very small now, but do it locally and starting the globalization process with your friends and everybody, and then that would make a contribution to this global vision of the world.
All right, Bob, we'll go to you next. What's your advice?
Yeah, I'd like to end with a quote from Pak Dino that is on the wall in the FPCI, and I think it's the sentence I'm going to take home with me most, and it is, if you believe in nothing and stand up for nothing, then you will achieve nothing and you will become nothing. So really the advice to the students, as a former student of international relations, don't be cynical, don't despair, don't give up. We at Klingendahl Institute have trained many generations of Indonesian diplomats in The Hague. I'm really looking forward to seeing some of you in The Hague. Thank you.
Very good. John, over to you.
Well, I think you have, in your generation, an amazing capacity to imagine and reach and achieve in your generation, unprecedented of past generations. I could not imagine a cell phone. I read yesterday that some scientists in Korea have now created a capacity for humans to regenerate teeth. So apparently we won't need dentures. We can grow teeth. That was not supposed to be possible, but now it's possible. So I encourage you to dare to imagine not only a peaceful world, but a prosperous world, a world that's just and has the capacity for universal fulfillment for everyone, everywhere. This is within grasp. We have the resources to feed the world, to create an opportunity for all your skills, talents, and your aspirations to be fulfilled. But you must dare to imagine and reach.
Thank you. Amitabh.
Tough question, but I would say, as a professor, and we are all, many of you are students, so the most effective, relevant answer I can give you is what I tell my students, that we all have to educate ourselves. So we are in the business of education. Education is absolutely central. But while you are educating, or we are educating ourselves, try to be, well, you can be nationalistic, but be empathetic. Empathetic means try to put yourself in the shoes of the people that you are interacting with, say your competitors in the community to the competitor in the international community. Try to understand the problem that we are all facing from the perspective of the other person, not just from your perspective. And this is basically called empathy. Not sympathy, but empathy. Try to internalize the perspective, the concerns of the other side. And don't be parochial. Every country is great, every country makes a contribution, but becoming too nationalistic and saying that my country, right or wrong, is also not the right way. And that is something comes from understanding international relations is a good way of doing this, global history, and I encourage studying global history, trying to understand how other people live, how other people conduct their foreign affairs, and what is the good elements we can borrow from them.
Very good. Ibu Dewi?
All the things I've wanted to say have been said. So I'll come as an Indonesian, and all of these Indonesian students here. I think we need to remember what President Sukarno said, that Indonesian nationalism lives in a garden of internationalism. Nationalism is important to strengthen our national identity, to unite the huge diversity in Indonesia, to help build self-confidence and independence, our free and active foreign policy. But Indonesian nationalism was never inward-looking. This is stated in the preamble to the Indonesian 1945 Constitution, that Indonesia must play an active role in promoting a truly perpetual peace and a just world order. So it is actually a mandated responsibility for every single Indonesian to care about what is happening outside. So rightly what Amita said, it should not be inward looking. So this is in fact Indonesian DNA. So being nationalistic is important because from Sabang to Merauke, we are an imagined community. Our national identity is not a given. It has to be constructed and nurtured all the time. And that is where the role of nationalism here is not the nationalism like during the Nazi Germany, which is very negative and against others. Our nationalism is more internal in nature, but our nationalism is also done for a purpose, to create a peaceful and just world system. And I think that every one of you, the fact that they've come here, I think hears that clarion call very, very loudly.
Thank you. What a magnificent panel. I think you, like me, have learned a lot during the course of today. It's pretty clear that one of the recommendations that we should make is more people internationally should come and participate in conferences like this. Because when we're forced to think not just about what we're doing today, but we're thinking about the future generation, that inherently makes us look forward, and I appreciate that very much. As I mentioned at the outset, in the last month alone, I've been in 8 different countries, and I've been enheartened that in every single country I've visited, there is this hunger to address this question. Whether you use the term rules-based order, whether you use the term the next world order, when you talk about like-minded countries, we're all trying to hold together to vestiges of the things that we value and to build something new. And I think these panelists have done a magnificent job about talking about building blocks for the future. So please join me once again in thanking this tremendous panel discussion on the next world order. And I will say that even though we had an hour and a half, we didn't cover half the amount of territory that Pak Dino did in his speech. So Pak Dino, we're working on it. Thanks. Okay, I think we're going to give back to the MC, and then we have group pictures. There we go.
Thank you very much. Please give a round of applause for our moderator, of course, our panelists. And now we invite to all panelists, of course, our moderator to please take a position on the center stage. For next, we will hand over a token of appreciation. For our first session, our A1 and the Citizen Diplomacy Hall. Please give a round of applause as we hand a token of appreciation for our moderator, Professor Gordon Flake, and all of our panelists, Professor Dewi Fortuna Anwar, Professor Amitav Acharya, Professor John Backer, Dr. Henry Wang, and Mr. Bob Dean. Please give a round of applause once again. For session A1, reimagining the next world order, what should be maintained, what should be changed, and why? And please take a position center stage for we'll take a group photo to the documentation team. Tim dokumentasi, kami persilakan untuk dapat bersiap. And yes, you may place the token of appreciation first on the seats. And ready? Sudah siap, tim dokumentasi? 3, 2, 1. Once again, 3, 2, 1.